Hello and welcome to today's episode of Footnotes. Today I'm joined by Mark London Williams. He is an American author, playwright, journalist, and creator of the young adult time travel series Danger Boy. As a journalist, Williams has written for Variety, Los Angeles Times Online, Los Angeles Business Journal, Moving Pictures Magazine, Digital Coast Reporter, and Below the Line, which covered film industry, politics, and entertainment. He has also written short fiction and comic books. He worked as a video game script doctor and has had several plays produced in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and London. He's also hosted several writers' workshops. So today we talk about the differences between a writer's workshop and a public education English course, or even between a writer's workshop and a college-level creative writing course. We talk about which aspects of the writing process go overlooked or unexplored in public education or in general college courses, and then the same regarding film and film history. We talk about his graphic novel, Two Trickster Tango, which he wrote in collaboration with artist Douglas Potter, in the context of his experience of the form and his likes and dislikes about it. We address the question of what is the place of the graphic novel in literature. We talk about what he takes into consideration when writing young adult fiction and how that intention can affect the writing process. Mark London is currently the man behind the Across the Pond column for British Cinematographer, and we talk about his experience traversing so many different mediums and topics, from writing young adult fiction to teaching courses to writing this column. I was struggling with really what to title this episode. Could it be what you didn't learn about writing, what you didn't learn about journalism, what you didn't learn about film history? But I think the central theme that we keep coming back to in this conversation is stories. So without further ado, here's today's episode of Footnotes, what you didn't learn about storytelling.
Used to write for the LA Weekly out here. He did a couple of indie film scripts. Then he sort of retired. He'd been in Texas. He grew up in New York, but he'd written for underground newspapers in Texas in the 70s, came out to LA. And I, as a young man, much closer to your age, and I moved to LA, I kind of grew up or came of age reading his, and he, I would say, is certainly one of my influences and how I approach journal, even though I'm not doing free roaming commentary like he is. I mean, I'm kind of in this more narrow silo of covering how movies and TV shows are made. But nonetheless, he and Hunter Thompson, there's certain people when I conceived of this is what you do in a column, he's one of my teachers, I would say. And he wrote a column. Again, I was a young man. This is the outset of the computer age. So I guess I don't think we would even have online ways to shut before Google Docs, but you had word processing, right? In your Mac or your PC, and you had disks for your program. You could save stuff on disks, which is that early dawn of electronic keyboarding. But he wrote a column about how the muscle memory is different. Like when he writes with a pen on paper versus typewriter, it was a different sort of tonal quality to his writing, a different emotional affect, which is even different than when he composed, especially when he did original composition on a keyboard. And we're in an age, 25 years after that column appeared, whatever, most of us, certainly I do most of my original composition as a journalist on a keyboard. But with fiction, it's different. I've just started a fiction project, which is a sort of ridiculous, quixotic thing to do. But I had to with fiction, I almost always have to start, not writing the story, but I have to start plotting in longhand, somehow to like notes about characters and settings. I need to be like away from the screen just to kind of get things churning. And then if they churn enough, then I could go to a screen and start to do narrative.
I think that makes sense because those are like the bare bones of the story, like the momentum of it, the shape of it, right? And like if you type those out on a screen in front of you, for me, it somehow feels less real than if you were like writing it down and like you have this piece of paper to go off of. This is where we start, and then you can type like the dialogue and stuff maybe, but like it's too easy to go back and erase something when it's on like a Google Doc or a Word doc, to like put your like bare bones of your story there.
Yeah, And there are some of my colleagues who write fiction more as a full-time calling, or scripts. I guess Scrivener I haven't used it yet. A lot of them swear by Scrivener because it has these aspects where you can do note cards. It's not just like word processing, or like where you're just going in and you're kind of the blank screen is saying, write me. So you can do note cards. You can replicate the process of working in a note, but I haven't done it yet, and I still go through a series of physical notebooks, and I'll kind of refer to them when I'm working on fiction or even sometimes screenwriting. script. I've done some starting some. At the moment, I'm exploring this platform of dramatic podcasts, which seems a way kind of like almost like writing for radio used to be, right?
Right.
A way of writing scripted drama that maybe is not quite overwhelmed the way film and television um, scripting is in terms of the number of projects and the hopes attached to them. But in any case, even for script, even though I used online, I use script writing software for that. Even there, I will still, if I feel I'm stuck, I'll leave the script, write notes. I'll even do rough drafts of scenes, or I'll do scenes in different, like sometimes I'll email myself. I'll have like an intermediate phase where I'm not in the program where I'm expected to be, like you say, kind of more. There's almost like an unspoken demand of it being more finalized. And sometimes I'll even email myself notes because I can just be like, well, maybe this guy on the train does this or that, and I'll just or save it as a draft of an email and then I'll look at it, but it's away from the main file. And sometimes
Right.
I just need a break from that kind of arena where the final construction is taking place.
I wanted to ask you, in addition to like in the context of writing fiction, do you ever like if you're working on a new project like you are now, do you like try to find ways to like maybe incorporate things that you had written before, which we're going to use for a fiction piece? And you're like, oh wait, that'd work here. Now I have the story for that, and kind of like mesh things together, or is it more like pioneering new solid thing and then you don't return to the others? I always want to ask writers that.
Absolutely. I guess I realize we're recording, so we're kind of on air. We're it's amiably chatting away, and I thought I guess this will kind of lead to our
Yeah, no, absolutely.
conversation.
I,
So
I,
I guess we're having that conversation right now. So.
yeah, I wanted to tell you that we were recording, but it was we were in the middle of talking, and I was like,
Right.
oh, now'd be a really good time to start recording because I feel like what we're talking about is pretty like immediately relevant.
Yeah.
And so I went ahead and started it. I record like the intro. Like today, I talked to
Yeah,
Mark Williams
separately.
suddenly or separately.
Right.
Yeah. And so yeah, we're just kind of chatting
Good.
away.
Good.
And I like to do like I mean, in the editing, I'm gonna do like little interjections maybe to like compartmentalize it a little bit more where I like come in and I'm like and then we started talking about this, or then I asked him about X, and that way it's kind of like has some structure. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's feel for you to be pretty laid back.
Good. All right. Now, did I lose speaking of trains, I lose my train of thought, but where were we? I was talking about sort of,
We were
well, you
talking
were talking about recycling ideas. Is that right?
right.
Or
Yeah, like
reusing.
reincorporating them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not entirely, but certainly chunks or things. And you, as a writer, you're kind of drawn to certain settings and ideas anyway,
Mm-hmm.
without even being aware of it. If you do this for a number, you look back, especially your own story making. I mean, things that someone else is not paying you to. I mean, if you're lucky enough to say be a paid television writer or screenwriter, well, film. We can talk about that too. The history of feature film writing, even though there are spec scripts that get sold, Hollywood feature films. It's not like the 70s when I came of age, where the whole idea was studios were looking for cool spec strips like Chinatown or The Parallax View, whatever. Sometimes they were based on books like 3 Days of the Condor, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but a lot of times they were originals like Nashville and things like that. These great films from the 70s, and that was the premium in Hollywood. Now, if you're lucky enough to be a feature film writer, you mostly will be working on assignment, or you'll be developing things with stars, or you'll be working, or your bread and butter will be writing a Marvel movie, and then you go back to indie features, whatever it might be. So not everything you do is your own creation, but when you look at stuff that's really comes from your own kind of wellspring of sources and traumas and ideas and all these things that contribute to wanting to tell a story about a thing, you'll find that motifs repeat even without it being a conscious process. I things that repeat for me are trains and baseball. I mean, I just love, because I love them, and I just, it's not like maybe I should just not have baseball. In fact, I didn't even plan this, but you see,
It worked out.
it would be like an A's or Giants. I grew up in the Bay Area, so it's more fashionable to choose between one or the other. But I love both the Giants and the A's. Having grown up in the Bay Area, the 60s and 70s, so I have my National League team and my American League team, both of which are doing well at the moment. So far so good. But anyway, so these motifs occur to me. On the other hand, this latest fiction project, which is for younger readers. I took an idea that I've had for, which is actually it's a train setting, so that's why I was thinking about it. But it was a specific train and a specific type of story, more of a shadowy mystery, but it's like cross genre elements. There's some horror in this one, but it's this idea I've had that I thought was going to go another way with different characters, but I'm using it for this other story that I had. It was more of ultimately winds up being more of kind of a monster story, again for younger readers. So I'm using this idea I've had for a long time in a different way, but it'd been kind of, it'd been in storage, waiting to be used. And again, I thought it was going to be this kind of story when I finally got to it, but kind of not even expecting to, because I started with the monster and sort of the stuff that happened in third, and I thought, they could go there. I could use this train idea at that. So I took an idea out of storage for that. So that does happen. You can surprise yourself that way.
So Mark, you do so many things, and like in your answers, it's like we can like swim around from like writing fiction to journalism to your involvement in the film world, and like there's something to contribute like to every answer that you have, just because you've done so many things from each of those fields. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you as a writer find and build and maintain what you would think of as like your voice when you're writing? When you're working in so many different areas, writing in so many different contexts, how does one keep their voice from just becoming like part of like what they're writing? Like some people think they can only write poetry, or think they can only write stories, or can only write nonfiction or something.
That's a good. I mean, that's a good question. And my, like, whether I'm sort of a jack of all trades, master of none sort of writer. I suppose it's an open question. I mean, I do have friends who primarily they write books, and their books do well enough that, and they have solid agency representation, and they have enduring relationships with editors, because sometimes if your editor leaves an imprint or your editor retires, sometimes like a person who liked your books is no longer in the publishing biz, and you're kind of rebooting, and some of that kind of stuff happens. But I've had friends that have maintained like careers writing one thing. And because I also work as a journalist, in fact, most of my work as a writer is as a journalist. And for the listeners here, it's as a film biz journalist in LA. I mean, more specifically. And I've written for a number of publications over the years. We can talk about how I sort of fell into that, which kind of coincided with the rise of the internet, which is partly how I fell into it. But we can get to that story or not. But for me, you do try and have partly it's sort of it's cultural references, the other books, films, ideas that you might refer to in a piece. I like to think I have kind of a wide array of things that reference, whether I'm going to quote, Satchel Paige, the great, the Negro Leagues pitcher, I could, maybe I'll put a Satchel Paige quote in a column that's actually ostensibly about, Oscar-winning cinematography, but maybe, some cinematographer will have a philosophy akin to Satchel Paige, don't look over your shoulder, something may be gaining on you or something. So that, so maybe there's something like that that's more my voice, or political stuff growing up in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, and being of its politics. I mean, being very much of those politics, and still having those kinds of politics that shape me. Some of that, I'm not writing a political commentary. Like when I do my column, I have a column in addition to articles. We can talk about the distinction there too. A column is ideally more your voice, even though the column I do, which is about cinematography and film production here in LA, and I do that for a British film magazine. I'm kind of their one-man Hollywood outpost. It's for British Cinematographer, which I think was along. I mentioned I started covering Oscars for Below the Line, and then it went on for a number of years, and that publication changed and downsized a bit, and we eventually had an amicable parting. But so I reapplied for Oscar credentials as a British cinematographer correspondent, and it's hard to get them. But they'd known me for like 8 years already, so they knew who I was, and I guess I hadn't written anything too egregious about the Oscars, so they let me back in under my new affiliation. But they kind of like having a lot of international press there, and even though I'm not I'm like a California boy, but I'm with an international publication, and they also kind of like that global because there are people in many different languages being spoken in the Oscar press room on award night. But anyway, so as a columnist, I do try and use more of my voice, like during the riots, for example, last summer, the Black Lives Matter, which is part of that process that led up to this recent verdict that we just had as of this week here in America, where a cop was actually found responsible for the taking of a life that didn't need to be taken.
It's crazy that there was even a question.
Wasn't even a question, and
Yeah.
it's taken this long to hold cops responsible for these egregious and flagrantly abusive uses of force that we've all been witness to and brutalized by as these things are captured more and more by digital technology. So now we know more, absolutely what's going on.
Right.
So in the middle of the riot, so I was, and normally the column, for example, I mean, it's for people who want to know about what's happening in movies and cinematography in America. We had this plague year, so part of the column became about remediation efforts to address the plague in California government, in Los Angeles, because this is where Hollywood is, what the unions were doing. But I could also legitimately write what the politicians were doing because it affected everybody's work, and writing about the play. So everybody becomes a different kind of reporter in a way during a moment of crisis. And so during the Black Lives Matter column, I opened one of my, during the riots over the summer, I opened one of my columns with a remembrance of this film, Medium Cool, directed by Haskell Wexler. I don't know if it was, I think Criterion now owns the disc. I don't know if it's streaming now, but Medium Cool was a film that Haskell, I'm going to, not to be overly Hollywood, I'm going to call Haskell by his first name because I met him. He read it earlier. He used to invite me to his office. He has since passed, to discuss, because I wrote this more political column on labor politics for Below the Line, in addition to writing about visual effects and covering nuts and bolts. But I actually was the kind of their labor columnist, because crew people are represented one of the last industries that have strong unions in America. Athletes and Hollywood filmmakers are like the only people left that have strong union representation anymore.
I did not know that.
Well, I mean, think about it. Who has strong unions? I mean, I guess there's a public service, public employees, teachers, depending on the state, teachers can have strong unions. But by and large, who has unions the way like auto workers used to? I mean, there's still auto workers and mine workers, but like only 9% of the American workforce is represented by a union, where it used to be a third of the American workforce in mid 20th century. So that's a lot less labor power.
That's wild. Well, I had seen I thought about how unions had spread to more sectors, but I hadn't thought about I kind of like now that the concept of a union is more familiar to maybe more people and in different areas of work. And so I always assumed that because I thought that was true, there were more unions total. I don't mean to go off on a tangent, but I was that kind of shocked me. I didn't know that.
And the irony is here I'm writing about all these things that people who are mostly in unions do for their livelihood, and I've been a freelancer with minimal kind of job protections most of my adult life. I mean, so yeah, and there's some unions that journalists have, but the way that work is changing. I mean, hardly anybody can even get a staff job as a journalist, and even I have a series of kind of ongoing freelance contracts, if you will, but no real job protection. It's only my them wanting me to keep writing. It's only editors wanting me to come back and write more that serves as any sort of protection or longevity in my my writing mode, my writing endeavors. But anyway, so back to Medium Cool. So Haskell, who's a very renowned cinematographer, Bound for Glory, was the visual consultant on American Graffiti, for example, which is a separate title because I think who shared, somebody else is credited as DP, and I'm blocking the name, but Haskell came in and helped. He would fly up from LA on weekends, and when Lucas was shooting that movie in Marin County, and help plan shots and things like that. So Haskell's had a fairly illustrious career as a cinematographer and well regarded, and he always had very adamant politics about working conditions and things like that. But anyway, Medium Cool, however, was not about. Later on, he would go to make documentaries about working conditions, which is what he'd like to have me in the office to write about, so I could put some of this working condition stuff in one of my columns. Medium Cool was a thing that happened that he shot as sort of a docudrama around the Chicago Convention, the riots of 1968. And you know about those from history.
Right.
I was a tot, but I was alive and watching those on TV as a kid. My age was still in single digits towards the end of the 60s, but that gives you kind of my timeline for watching the passing parade here. So, but Haskell had done this, and he'd really not directed much, and he wouldn't direct much after either. Again, a couple of documentaries, but with the late Robert Forster, who just passed just a few months ago, who of course Quentin Tarantino revised his career with Jackie Brown, but Robert Forster was in it as a this kind of aloof news cameraman who was looking at these events and like the riots and things like that, and trying to keep a distance and not get involved. And Haskell's film is about how sometimes events are so demanding and overwhelming that you kind of have to get involved, even though you're allegedly supposed to just keep this sort of neutral eye as a recorder. And so he questions like, what is there really such a thing as the neutral stance when people are being gassed and killed and beaten in the streets or not? And there was a very, it was a very vital, it was that kind of cinema. It was late 60s, 68 or 69 when this film came out, but it really pointed to what would happen in 70s cinema. It was already that start of that cinematic revolution, right? So I just talk about now with these riots going on last summer. So here I write this sort of remembrance of Medium Cool and having known Haskell and what this movie was about and how it spoke to its time, but how it's again speaking to our time as a so I'm juggling a few balls. On the one hand, I am making a kind of a socio-political commentary. It was important to me about these events demand our attention. At the same time, I'm also, for any readers who hadn't thought about Haskell, depending on their age or didn't really know him, if they were below a certain age, I'm writing a remembrance of a renowned cinematographer who brought a lot to the art, and telling people who may not have known about it, one of his film, like what happened when a cinematographer stepped into the director's chair because he felt so importantly about the subject. In other words, he wasn't going to be a neutral observer. He was going to make a movie about the subject. So about a third of that column is about Medium Cool and a remembrance of Medium Cool, more like an essay. And then the other third I talk about, because that summer I was writing a lot about people suddenly scrambling to work from home or finish movies from home, and how they worked with their visual effects producers, or if they had a render shot or do color correction, which is the thing cinematographers need to do to make sure the colors are in a scene or what you intended them to be when you originally recorded, either shot on film or more likely recorded the digits, etc. So I had more practical aspects to what was going on, the more practical sorts of types of coverage in the last half of this column. But the first part, I got to do an essay on Medium Cool, yet sticking to the kind of the mission, if you will, the charter of what this column is supposed to be about. So that's part of how I find my voice in a way, even when I'm covering even somebody, that's pretty limited. You're not just writing about movies in general. In this kind, you're writing about cinematography, like one specific art. Although, again, the way judges have changed everything, that art ties into visual effects. They, how they work, how they collaborate with production designers and editors. So even in the cinema, when I'm writing cinematography, even that's not really restricted to one art form. And then I write for other publications where it's more broad anyway. I contribute to the credits, and even talking, actually, one editor, I can't name the publication yet because it hasn't happened, but they may want to bring me on board for additional Emmy, because now that Oscar's about to wrap up, we're now in the pregame conversation for Emmy season, which is the end of summer. These are the rhythms of life in LA. There's all these conversations from about October to February normally are all about Oscars and who's going to win, what's going to be nominated for Screen Actors Guild, Golden Globes, then that all ends. It's like 2 weeks of people regathering their wits and their breath, and then you're off to the Emmy speculation. And of course, what's fascinating as technology changes is a lot of these same big, whereas before Emmys and Oscars were separate. MGM and Columbia and Paramount are over here on Oscars, and NBC and CBS and ABC, and maybe later Fox are over here on the Emmy side. And then with streaming, with digits and streaming, everything's changed. Now it's Amazon and Netflix, Oscars and Emmys, and Disney Plus, the Oscars. And so people aren't even sure where that's headed necessarily, if you're really kind of awarding work that's really shows up on the same exact platform. I mean, we'll see.
Right. Well, you had worked, you mentioned that you'd worked in freelance for most of your adult life, and I think that's part of why like you're able to juggle like so many different things in your work now, and like the kind of like your different endeavors, which can be like to you, because you've reached a point where you can handle it, as like freeing, but some people could see as like stressful or daunting. And it seems like what I see a lot of right now is like up and coming writers are often told like, well, you're going to have to work freelance. It's like there are a lot of like good opportunities there. You have more freedom, and it kind of gets hyped up. And then there's also this understanding that it's just like where you have to go, at least especially in the creative space. And so I was wondering if you think that's true, if there's any truth to that. And then also like kind of from your background, we could get a little bit autobiographical, and talk about like what are some ways for people to overcome any fears they might have about the freelance world, or how to manage their time and things like that.
Well, I mean, I can, with so much sort of at will employment, I mean, you could be in just as much jeopardy thinking you have a steady job, actually, with the way the economies are set up. And of course, as we mentioned, people not having, any really kind of union protection. You can just be let go from your job if your employer can close a downturn and can't afford all these people. So it's possible some types of job security are illusory, even in a more mainstream setting. But yeah, I mean, I always kind of like my temperament. I mean, I was probably better suited to being a freelancer. Uh, I'm not good at the patience for a lot of office politics anyway. And so I was like working remotely and mostly working from home long before it became fashionable. I did. We can maybe I also teach writing in different settings, and some of those were in person, and some of them not. Some of them online. And so I would have, and of course, when it's not a play gear, you do physically go to places as part of your freelance work as a reporter, in my case, as a correspondent. So you go to movie screenings and award shows, or just events or gatherings, receptions, you network around and meet people that publicists would like you to meet, because you might interview them, or however it's going to work out. So you do physically go to places. You have a social life, even as a freelancer who's churning out copy at home. But I've always self-pay. I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but I think it was about the worry. I mean, just you have to kind of know yourself if you're if you can just keep yourself keep the pacing. I mean, I teach an online class for adult learners, kind of a business English class, and it's basically just sort of doing like learning how to do PowerPoint and write memos coherently and report. It's just about being a more coherent communicator in your workplace, essentially, even though it's a communications and English class in this sort of business oriented school. Um, but and people have lives, and a lot of they're younger than me, and they're still a lot of them are actively raising kids and things like that. So I get it, but it's still hard for people to understand like how much time you have to allow to get a thing done. In this case, a piece of writing, right? So people always say, "Oh, I didn't realize it took me this long," and they're always asking for deadline extensions. I'm a reasonably merciful professor, so I usually give them an extra day, because it takes me a couple of days to grade all the stuff that comes in at the beginning of a week. So that's fine. Life happens. But my point is, you have to really be willing to do that, because it's one thing to ask a professor for a delay in a class, but it's another thing to not get into work that somebody is waiting to pay you for, and that's a different. You have to be able to do that. And I guess it's just sort of your taste for, as you say, that kind of stress and that kind of pain. And it's not. And there's some weeks when nothing is due. So sometimes you don't have an immediate thing that's due, and then sometimes you have like three things that are due the same week. I had a week like that. We had thought about an earlier time to do this, and I mentioned what a busy week I had. It's because I had papers from two classes, and I had three articles within about 8 days that were due, which is sort of unusual. One was like at the outset, I had finished over the weekend, and then I had two articles for the credits, which were um, on an Oscar-nominated documentary on time, and then I did a visual effects article, and I was grading all these papers. And it was like so I really every day I was like just kind of getting through stuff, like, but you just have to you just have to be used to erratic rhythms in your life, right? Because everything's not going to be it's not going to have the same pace day to day or week from week, and you just have to be used to that. And you just if it depends if you value kind of regularity and constantly repeating routine, it might not be for you. But if you can stand the variances and adapt to them, then you may have a good appetite for freelancing.
We touched on your teaching just a little bit, and I was wondering, I didn't know you taught a business communication class. I knew that you taught some film history classes and had
Yeah.
done some writers workshops. What is anything that I'm missing there that you would also be interested in talking about from your teaching career? And also, like, which is like your favorite, if you have a favorite, to delve into in like a classroom setting?
Well, I mean, again online. I have another friend, and this you never know what's going to lead to anything. These covers in back of me actually happen. They're the earliest covers from my Danger Boys, which is a time travel series for sort of middle grade young adult readers I wrote that came out in the sort of the early aughts. They were mostly coming out sort of circa, gosh, like 2001 to 2008, but
Mm-hmm.
they got reprinted in different editions. By Candlewood Press, and these are the no longer extant tricycle press editions. But anyway, so a mom whose school I came to, and her son, who I think is now out of college, as my youngest son is about to be, but her son, this is how long like was in grade school, and you would go in those days too, when schools had more budgets and publishing was a little more traditionally before ebooks had kind of taken over. As a children's author, you would often do school visits because they had budgets to bring in authors, and you'd do workshops. Teachers all want you to do creative writing workshops. Or I would do things about time travel. I would do writing prompts about time travel or like implements. As you can see, but one of the books he's holding Excalibur, the sword, because he goes back to Arthurian England. So it also kind of challenges you if you have that itch to kind of be a creative writing teacher of some sort, and usually if you're a writer, it means you had somebody who was sort of tolerant of you in a creative writing, or was an inspiration to you in some English class or creative writing, or in your life somewhere. So that's kind of giving some of that back. But anyway, she'd remembered this for years, and then she later had a career as her children grew. She became such an adept college advisor to them and then their peers. She made it a business, like, because her friends started saying, "Well, God, all this stuff. Can you help my?" This is already some years ago when the kids who I'd done this workshop with, and we always stayed in touch was the thing. And then she becomes this sort of college admissions advisor, and then that leads to these other jobs she has creating as the digital world becomes more robust, creating online seminars and classes for kids who want to kind of round out some of their experiences or their humanities experiences, because kids were getting less and less of those in schools, including kids outside of the US. And so some of these were like English speaking Chinese high school kids who were inbound for US colleges. So she got in touch with me. Again, we've been in touch over the years, maybe some small collaborations here and there. She'd maybe send somebody my way, might want to like creative writing tutoring. But I would, talk to parents, maybe do 5 or 6 lessons online, things like that. But anyway, she and I started to develop classes together, these humanities on science fiction writing and film history for these high school students. And they've been on and off for the last few years, more off than on during the plague year, only because of the parents, not really feeling that much of their money was extra, right? This would be in addition to the students' regular schooling. But so I developed, and those are always great because you develop, like in a film history class, you think, well, what you really have to winnow out, like what films are important to me, or everybody besides what films are important to me, what films convey a certain moment of change in Hollywood that I want to convey to them, and what do I think they should look at, even if maybe it's not a film that's on my top 10, but it's important for them to look at for whatever reason. And the same with books and stories, like when you're doing a syllabus for science fiction, like, well, here's not somebody I read that much of her or him, but it's important for them to know who this writer is. So I'm going to put them on my syllabus because they should know who this voice is, because it's important to the development of sci-fi. I mean, so that's an example there. Um, so that kind of refreshes you as a reader and a viewer, and to be a good writer of, I mean, not just to report on these things as someone who chronicles these things as a journalist, but if you want to make books and movies, a maker of stories in these formats, you need to be a good reader and a good viewer. You need to absorb, you need to absorb the work of people whose shoulders you are invariably standing on. So it's always fun from that standpoint. Another class very similar that I'd done before this, though, um, it was sort of after my earliest days as a children's book author doing workshops. and before my more recent online teaching, I had some rather splendid fun years at Disney in what they call their Creative Academy, teaching evening classes to Disney employees there. And what that was, Creative Academy was part of this initiative. Basically, it was like a free community college inside Disney, basically, where they wanted their, and I wasn't teaching the people who were writing television shows or movies how to write, but it was for people in other departments that weren't necessarily the creative, like people who made assistants to vice presidents, or making, maybe they book travel arrangements for executive employees, or maybe they're in website design, or maybe, I mean, I had some public from Disney Publishing, but they weren't writers, they were like assistants to editors and things like that. So I had people from different uh, branches of the Disney tree, and it kept growing. I was there. Acquired they acquired both Lucasfilm and then Marvel during those years, and which actually have a story about the hero's journey that sort of extended my teaching time there because of that. But these seminars, which originally started out again because I had the Danger Boy books to time travel, so I read. They kind of like, well, teach science fiction writing, and then science fiction fantasy for young adults. It was kind of specific, like for people who might have a fantasy being like YA authors. So I taught initially writing for young adults, and then that spread. I taught comic book writing, essay writing because I was a journalist. I actually did do a couple of nonfiction, did like a nonfiction memoir class, which is pretty fun. Which is not something I usually teach. If I teach, it's usually more fiction writing. But it actually was fun to teach nonfiction. Again, comics was fun, and they kept having me back to teach other kinds of writing classes. So it expanded, and so again, the challenge is, it expands, or you are encouraged to go back and re-explore what you loved about a certain genre or format in order to teach it well, right? So you get kind of refreshed. So like, if you haven't read a James Baldwin essay in a long time, you're teaching essay writing, it's a good time to go back and read Baldwin, things like that.
Right.
But it was great fun being and things finally changed, and people, again, like the people who hire you kind of leave, and their budgets change, and they offer different benefits for employees. And it wasn't just me. I would these series of classes, it could be like, there was the dance classes and fine art classes like painting and drawing, and how to use Adobe Photoshop, all kinds of evening classes. And so I was one of the electives, if you will, for Disney employees.
When you were teaching, either with Disney or outside of that context, part of the tone of this show is like, what are things that people like you think people should know based on like your profession that they don't, right? Or what did I miss out on when I was in school, or things like that. And so I wanted to ask you, with your experience in the industry, is there anything that you kind of include in the curriculums that you think, what, this might not be in everyone's curriculum for this kind of class, but damn it, I think this is important, and I think this is cool and important for people to know about, that kind of go underappreciated in maybe other spaces?
But that's a really good question. I mean, now it's almost more a question of which works you focus on, not so much the idea of like they should look at a movie or a TV show, or read a graphic novel if they want to, but maybe you're going to emphasize a graphic novel they wouldn't have heard of. I mean, on the one hand, you should know what Watchmen is if you're teaching graphic novels, but on the other hand, you might want to know this thing that came out in the 90s from an imprint of VC's called Stuck Rubber Baby, which is a memoir about growing up gay in the South, which really knocked me out at the time I read it. It's sort of, people know about it and people really love it, but like unless somebody tells you about it, you don't come across it. That's just one example of a graphic novel I like to put in people's hands. Kings in Disguise, which is a kind of a realist kind of, if a film would be neo-realism about runaway kids in the Depression, hanging out with older hobos. That's a great. It was written by a guy who used to be a playwright. I used to meet him. I met him when I used to go to Comic-Con. So sometimes it's a matter of the works you focus on rather than the concept. But conceptually, you and I, prior to actually having the conversation, we talked about both our love, I think, our admiration for Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, which is maybe, and we're not going to go into it for the listeners here. I mean, there's plenty of resources to learn about it, but basically, as most of us now know, because it's been so more widely spread, Joseph Campbell was a professor who did this originally academically. He found out there was a similar kind of apparatus in the mythological structures of peoples all around the world long before they could be in touch with each other. They weren't watching each other's shows on Netflix, each other's foreign language shows on Netflix, and they weren't even shipping books to each other. I mean, he's talking about for thousands of years, the sort of the gear, the apparatus of myth making has these hero figures. Campbell just, he would mostly talk about the hero in the male sense, and many of these cultures, of course, would often focus on male heroes in terms of who went out and journeyed and did things, and have different roles for female adventurers. Although there's some conversation about whether that was entirely accurate, and especially if you look at cultures with pantheons of both gods and goddesses. So there's some reasonable critique to be had of Joseph Campbell as we continue to develop and grow as beings. But he nonetheless had this very intriguing notion that there's certain things that happen in stories that make myths powerful, like a young initiate, often an orphan. And if you look at, like, who's an orphan? Everyone's an orphan. Dorothy Gale from Oz, Luke Skywalker, which will get why that's important. James Bond is now an orphan in the Daniel Craig reboot, right? All these all these orphaned characters. So they're kind of tabula rasa, right? They're sort of these unwritten on forms in a way, and so they become more adept when inevitably there's a wisdom figure, a wizard, usually a spirit guide, a Jedi, a Jedi Knight, whoever it's going to be, a good witch, a scarecrow, whoever's going to be advising you on the journey. And you have you develop traveling companions. Gandalf, if you're Frodo, who also would seem to be an orphan. Yes, his uncle Bilbo, but he has no parents around. So often it's orphans in these roles. So I don't know what the psychology is. But so Joseph Campbell had this very exciting way of breaking down the structure of stories, including certain trials that the hero would go through, and then almost like a belly of the whale, he called it, and there'd be kind of like a rebirth, right? And almost a kind of a death, or a spiritual death, or an emotional death, and a rebirth before the hero has to do what he or she sets out to do. So this became, initially, I'd heard of it, not so much in school, even as a theater major. You talk about a major that people would normally try and talk you out of. I was actually a theater major as an undergrad. Later I got a graduate degree. I was an undergrad at Berkeley. But I took a lot of political science. You had to take classes outside the field of your major. So I took a lot of poli-sci, because I love poli, and I took a lot of but I took like physics and astronomy classes for non-majors because I wasn't very great at the math, I will confess. So I needed classes. I love the ideas of astrophysics, the concepts of it, but I needed the math to be minimized. So as I guess you could see, here's a guy who's going to write sort of politicized science fiction because all the trappings are there. But anyway, but Campbell, now that I think about it, we're studying Shakespeare and the Greeks and all these great playwrights, which I still am thankful that I had exposure to those works. But there's no heroes. But we didn't get that as an analysis tool. And even when I went back to grad school in a writing program at USC here in LA, which is now itself a while ago, but even then, I don't recall coming across Joseph Campbell as or Jung, and then Campbell leads you to kind of to Jung, but it does get you to Aristotle. I guess we had the Poetics, and if it goes Aristotle Poetics, and he was the one that broke down what we call the 3-act structure, which Robert McKee sort of monetized that with his screenwriting workshops and the catharsis and all these terms people in writing you can learn about or know. So Aristotle, I guess we did have Aristotle. So but we didn't go on to like Jung and the archetypes, because Jung's archetypes about certain types of characters that recur in storytelling because they're part of our collective unconscious. And then Campbell built on the work of Jung. So I brought in, I also used the Poetics, which again, I suppose I did have in school, but it wasn't until I got back to Campbell. And Campbell, at the time I was Campbell had been known because Lucas credits Star Wars, of course, to just following sort of the almost beat by beat roadmap laid out by Joseph Campbell. There's a young novitiate, a young novice in the village, Luke, right? And then he's an orphan, and he's sort of a double orphan because he also loses his aunt and uncle. And then there's the wisdom figure comes, and the traveling companions with the droids, right? And then the event, the rebirth, and literally the belly of the whale, he's in the trash compactor, and then they get sprung from that. And as he learns his Jedi powers, he's more using the Force at the end. It's kind of what Campbell would call the boon, right? You learn how to you're adept with whatever the magical uh, incantation or implement is that you acquire. And of course, that could be a scientific one now, in more technological oriented story. So anyway, so here Lucas gives Campbell the credit because I guess at USC at film school in the 60s, they did use Joseph Campbell. So he credits that for Star Wars. And then he does this PBS series shortly before Campbell passed on well, Campbell's original book was called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and I think the PBS thing, narrated by or hosted by Bill Moyer, was the hero's journey, and so that made Campbell more popularized. But still, I had never. I mean, the first time I had Campbell in a class was when I was a teacher of hero's journey material, and then Jung, and then teaching that got me. I didn't start out with Jung, the archetypes, but I kept looking at where Campbell got it from. So I kept exploring around, and I kept learning more about it the more I taught it. And what happened is, the anecdote here is, because you kind of wax and wane, Disney would have certain budgets, and the budget for the Creative Academy would wax and wane, and sometimes they'd have a class, or sometimes it'd be a week, a couple months, or a session of no classes. And they might call you back, at the end of summer because you hadn't taught for a while, whatever it would be. But so here they acquire very publicly Lucasfilm, and I was still in touch with the woman who kind of oversaw the programming. And she was like talking about other, like, you still interested in teaching? You want to come in? And I said, yeah. And I said, I suppose now that you've acquired Lucasfilm, you're going to want me to do a class on the hero's journey. It was kind of a joke. It's like a George Lucas hero's journey, sort of making a Lucas, sort of a semi joke. I just thought, and she wrote back saying, oh, would you? Do you have a class? Like, I go, oh, yeah, yes, I do, as a matter of fact. And I didn't, but I went and created one. So actually, then the sort of the last third of my time, I mean, the remainder of my time at Disney, once I started to do that, was actually almost all hero's journey and archetypes and Jung. It was almost like the roots of storytelling. And in fact, I might have even called some of the classes. So I was no longer teaching like writing science fiction for kids, YA writing, or I was the roots of storytelling. And then what happened is certain departments would send their employees to the class because they thought it would make them better. Like I wound up teaching a few versions of this at the headquarters of the Disney store, which for people in LA is in Pasadena. Disney Studio, everybody knows, like Disney Studio, which is expanded because they also acquire what used to be DreamWorks and Glendale. I would teach, and Marvel became part of that campus. They always like to call these things campuses now. And that's where I would do most of my teaching. But I also wound up teaching at the Disney store headquarters, and they wanted their employees to be able to take these classes because they thought knowing about where, I think they had an idea of like why certain audiences were responding, like why a little girl or a little boy would respond to a certain character, what he or she might have loved about this character in whatever story is bringing them into the Disney store, whether that was a series on Disney Plus. Well, there wasn't a Disney Plus in those days, but a series on Disney Channel, or a film, live action, animated, whatever it was. They thought it would help their employees to be better at what they did, from like store design to just being a sales associate, if they
Right.
knew why it was that people responded at a deep, almost pre-articulate or intuitive level to some of these stories and some of these characters.
I think that's probably pretty accurate of them to think that. When you think about, like, if someone's designing a store, the way they incorporate like a character from a movie or something into that store is going to be changed by which aspects they're trying to emphasize, or which kind of tone they're trying to strike. Like, how do people relate to these characters, and why? And
Right.
we can use that psychology to
Right.
direct that. I want to comment real quick and say too that I found it interesting because I've been an English major for 2 years, and then I was a like education major before that,
Mhm.
and with like an emphasis in English. I was transitioning from like thinking about teaching high school to thinking about teaching like at a community college or something.
Mhm.
And so one thing I noticed a lot is that I happened to know about Joseph Campbell and about Carl Jung, like from my own personal stuff that I just happened to
Right.
bump into.
Right.
But in the classroom, If there was going to be a class on it, and there wasn't. But if there was, it would be like its own class because it would have to be. Because in like the literature survey classes and things, unless you have a lot of time on your hands, like it would. I don't. The breaking stories down to like their psychological components doesn't happen. You kind of stop at like
Right.
the overarching culture, the life of
Right.
the author, and you leave it up to the author and the culture. But there's something else there. There's always more there. It just
That's
takes
right.
you have to go a little bit deeper to find that, because some things like the hero's journey resonates with so many people that it is
Right.
not like a nationality thing or like an individual
Right.
author thing, you know.
Right. And there's still, and this, Hugo was writing in response to the French Revolution. I mean, that's all true. And the contemporaneous, we can look at all those aspects, but at the same time, there's something sort of intuitive of the way Victor Hugo is approaching his work, you know, whether it's The Hunchback or Les Miserables or whatever it may be. So absolutely, there's a historical moment. There's what you write in the wake of the French Revolution or the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, or what people are going to write in the wake of the pandemic and the insurrection, and but nonetheless, there's still, as you say, there's going to be this kind of clockworks underneath. I don't want to reduce it to like a mechanistic thing, but there's still going to be these parts that you say that will transcend the historical moment, that will still be elements of storytelling as they've been felt and responded to for millennia.
So I wanted to talk to you too about how when it comes to storytelling, you are in like, I don't want to say like a unique niche, but like I think it's kind of unique, decreasingly so, in that there's just more of it out there. But you write young adult literature. You wrote the that time traveling series, and then you're working on another fiction story right now. It's more of a monster story geared for
Yeah.
young adults. And so I was wondering, what is that space like for you, and what are the like unique challenges that come with that space? How does your voice change as a writer? How does your writing process change when you're doing that? Writing the young adult fiction?
That's a good question. And I mean, for me, I've been in and out of it. I've had friends that have been able to sort of steadily stay in it, but in my case, I'm like the editor who really loved Danger Boy, left the imprint, um, and then you some agents are more or less effective than other agents, and whether they can sell things or not. So, and I've had some near misses on projects that almost sold and didn't quite. So that it can be kind of frustrating. You think maybe it's not for me anymore. And yet these stories keep suggesting themselves to you. The most recent publication I had was now about, gosh, like 4 years ago, I guess. Again, my zombie book from a small press that itself has since gone out of business, because small presses also, they try and make a go of it. They try and use online strategies and ebook sales to sort of work around not having the same representation at, say, book festivals, or back when bookstores could be open regularly, on bookstores, shelf space and things like that. But I had a zombie book for younger readers, Max Random and the Zombie 500, and that got optioned, even though it was a limited sort of a cultural imprint in terms of how it was advertised, or who became aware of it. It got optioned by a friend of mine who I knew actually through my sort of showbiz journalism circles. And they optioned it and developed it, and there's a pilot script, and they're trying to get it placed as a streaming series. Which, if that happened, I guess it would sort of change the game. But it's a boy on the spectrum, Max Random of the title, but the book is narrated by the girl he picks up, and he picks her up in the first chapter because her family has just been wiped out by reanimated beings, and they journey to this uncertain destination for where one or more of their parents may or may not be waiting for them, and they have to go through the post-apocalyptic landscape of LA. And there's some science. I try to make a kind of a plausible scientific, my zombie virus in this case were nanobots that went amok, and nanobots in the bloodstream that self-replicated and sort of colonized the body. So that's my, so that's my, and now I have, and it just seems almost quixotic though to keep trying it, because as publishing restricts itself, right? Bigger companies take over all these imprints. Simon and Schuster recently sold itself, and you have like all these giant companies like Bertelsmann, which is based in Germany owns Random House and Penguin and things like Penguin Random House. I mean, the fact we're even saying Penguin Random House. I mean, it just becomes
Right.
harder, even though they're separate imprints. It becomes harder and harder to kind of crack this corporate edifice. And part of the problem is they want everybody to be sort of an instant bestseller now. Like you have to have a big social media platform, and the marketing departments really don't want to do. They want you to already be kind of self-marketed as an entity, as an authorial entity, and it makes them more willing to take on your book as opposed to just what the story's about. So these things make it harder. And whether kids, young readers are reading. I mean, some read, but they also video games. There's all kinds of other attention competing for their eyeballs now. That was not the case, for example, when my generation of authors, right? Some of us are older, obviously they're younger authors than us, but nonetheless, we're still of a moment where a lot of adults writing for kids grew up when there was mostly only books and comics, and then film and TV show for you to point your eyeballs toward. And video games have really changed, I think, narrative pacing and a lot of the way uh, young readers, their expectations of being able to interact with stories and things like that. I mean, reading is its own pleasure, but what that's going to mean um, for whether people want to sit down and read whole books, whether they just want to read pieces of books and like flash fiction. Um, I don't know if we've all kind of sorted that out yet. Books can still have large impacts, of course, but we had a kind of a great century of the book. I mean, it was sort of, novels didn't really start taking up in America, at least becoming. England might have been a bit different because you already had Dickens, but even Dickens is like mid 19th century, right? Later in America, you have Uncle Tom's Cabin. You start to have this industry. You have this robust publishing industry, book publishing industry, lasts through most of the 20th century. Whether it will last through most of the 21st, is, in any kind of recognizable form, is still an open-ish question. I mean, books will always be there the way vinyl is still there for records, but I don't know how we craft stories that are only made of words is a good question. And for me, it's also, I'm not, even though I'm very fortunate and I'm grateful that I've had a fairly consistently, as a journalist, I've been fairly consistently responded to for, many, many years over my writing life. And there's always been one outlet or another where I've had stuff published. Books have been harder. Books have been much more kind of hit and miss, so, which I was said earlier, maybe it's fairly quixotic for me to be embarking on another one, but that was this story, and it was this place. This one place. Well, we'll look at 3 chapters in an outline. I thought, I could write. I don't have to write. I can write 3 chapters in an outline. Hardly anybody will. I mean, that's how I sold Danger Boy, which is not how you even supposed to. You need to write the whole book now, basically.
Right.
They want you to boom have the whole book ready if they like it. But here's a place saying if we like it, we'll give you a small advance. So my goal now is 3 chapters in an outline, and we'll see how it fares.
You mentioned that physical books will probably always, like long form physical books will probably always be a thing. Maybe one day though, in the way that vinyl records are a thing still for
Right.
music now. But
Right.
vinyl records have become like a fetishized object almost, where it's like it's like someone who's a part of a certain subculture like will collect them, or someone who's like an audiophile like is probably
Right.
going to collect them, or someone
Right.
who's a giant fan of a certain artist might collect ones for that artist.
Right.
And I was concerned, like even like growing up, like bookishness as like a trait has reached a point where it's been like really heavily romanticized, which is good. That's great, but also like on the inverse, like that means something else is happening that's a little bit like the opposite. Like we're like less people are reading, so like the person you see with like 4 books or something that they're carrying around, in school when you're young, you're like, oh wow, this
Yeah.
person's not like it's a whole personality type. And I feel like at that point, like that makes me worried, and that it's not like are they a standard person of like the standard person's life in our culture anymore, um maybe like maybe every now and then, like if someone's in like a book club or something, but I know a lot of people who just don't read books anymore.
Right.
I don't mean to
I
sound
know.
like I don't want to sound like the fun police or anything. Like I'm not
Right.
trying to give off that vibe, but it's like there's fun to be had if you sit down and read a novel. I
Yep.
promise.
And even so, even when I was and at sort of the apex of my moment in kid lit publishing, as people in kid lit will often call it, I was what was called a boy book writer, and that was one of the reasons they took on Danger Boy, because there was a boy protagonist. But I have three narrators. It's in the first book he goes back to the library at Alexandria. So Thea, who's a counter narrator, she's the daughter of the last librarian at Alexandria, based on this actual woman Hippolyta, who was brutally murdered by religious fundamentalists, and so talked about how little things change over the eons. Because she was too cosmic, she would lecture on astronomy and all these. She was inevitably accused of being a witch and things that smart women in history are inevitably accused of being.
Right.
So my character is her daughter, and then there's a dinosaur character who is stranded who comes from a parallel Earth, an M planet, where there was no meteor and dinosaur evolution never stopped. So the velociraptors became sort of like primates, and they just kept evolving into sort of hominid creatures. So they take turns narrating the book. So that's the sort of the conceit of Danger Boy. Anyway, when I was brought aboard in publishing, I was informed I was one of the reasons they liked my books, because they were boy books. Which, I don't even know, maybe things have changed enough even this century that I don't think use that term. But the idea behind it were statistics showing that boy readers dropped off at a much earlier age than girl readers. And not to be too stereotyped, and I don't know if this is still true, because especially you have like more girl gamers, you have things competing for their eyeballs too. But basically, girls would be more willing to keep reading after a certain age than boys. And they found that girls would generally be more willing to read boy books, like boys with boy heroes, than boys who would not really be caught at all reading a book with a girl hero
Right.
because that was, as you're trying to construct your whatever kind of fragile armor for masculinity, which always seems to have fairly fragile armor based on how we look at the way men have behaved through history.
When I was like 16, maybe younger, maybe like 14 or 15, I read The Fault in Our Stars, and I cried.
John.
Yeah, and I was like 14, 15, so I cried like a
Yeah.
lot, and I was
Yeah.
no shame. I had to tell my friends, like, I read this book and I cried, and will you please come with me to watch the movie? And so and then I didn't cry during the movie, which was like weird, because some people cry like when they watch movies and not when they're reading. But still, like, so at least that gave me, like, it gives us like a little bit of hope about like what books people should, would be encouraged by their like friends or social community to read or not read.
The exception that maybe proves that rule, but then again, as sort of old constructs of gender breakdown, maybe that is a hopeful sign too. Maybe as more and more kind of willingness to talk about what had been maybe artifices of gender separation, the way we were sort of brought up or trained to think, to perceive ourselves as, therefore I'm this gender, so I can only like this stuff, and as that becomes more and more discussed and change, and as I say, and the barriers kind of break down on that spectrum, maybe you're right. Maybe it would be less and less of a daunting thing, or for some young boy that wanted to pick up a book, less of a terrifying. Partly will depend on the context of where this person is who wanted to maybe pick up a book. Whether they're in a place where they're going to get thrown down the stairs at school, or whether they're in a place where there's they're going to be supported at the school's Rainbow Club on campus. I mean, that's a big difference in locality.
Do you, so as that structure, that like dichotomy kind of like culturally dissolves slowly, but like eventually,
Right.
There, like the story structures that we talked about earlier, the kind of Jungian archetypes and the hero's journey, on the other hand, seem to be doing like the opposite, where stories, because, and this is speculation, but because companies that produce like original content for films and stuff, streaming services that have to produce their own content now, like, and even Disney with everything that they've acquired, like the goal is to make like a story like as clean cut, not necessarily direct, immediately formulaic in some way, but like break it down to like the purest version of this story that it can be, and like include all the things that we know people like because we've been making movies forever, and try to like combine those into like what would be the perfect movie for us, and also like the pressure to just do that quickly, I wonder about that. And are you ever concerned about like with the amount of content that gets publicized every day in film and television streaming services, and even in the book world, because so many people can do like self
That's
publishing
right.
pretty easily these days.
Right.
Do you worry about things getting like too formulaic in the mainstream, and if that would like influence the way that we wrote maybe in a negative way in the long term, or do you think that they're kind of separate things?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, as these same entities, and usually or often it's the same corporate entities that own now the publishers and the filmmakers. The stream, I guess. I mean, look at Amazon is a perfect example of that. Netflix has yet to buy a publishing company, but I guess give them time.
Right.
Um, um, but on the other hand, they're also trying to they also sort of attenuated to micro audiences. I think what gives me hope though is this idea, instead of everything having to be a massive hit. I mean, there's still, I mean, Disney still has that hope for its Marvel movies and its Star Wars movies, but putting aside these, the sort of the lust or the thirst for franchise safety that a lot of big entertainment producers have. There seems to be in parallel to that this idea of more micro or niche audience. Well, not everybody has to like Scandinavian noir, or not everybody has to like 13 Reasons Why, for adapting J. Asher's book there. It was kind of on that John Green spectrum, right, in terms of
Mm.
the subgenre of YA it exists in. But not everybody has to like that. But if enough people like it, and especially if it's not the pressure of a movie, it has to do great on an opening weekend, but can just exist as our offerings here on Prime or Netflix or Disney Plus. And I don't want to romanticize it, but on the other hand, the upside to some of these entities is it does bring back what used to exist in publishing and doesn't anymore, called the mid list, and the mid list was back when it was the bookstore model and physical books. The mid list, because books didn't have, there were a few huge hits, of course, and things would break out and they would help pay for other books. But there are also books that they could keep in print a long time, because if they sold a few copies sort of steadily over years, or even if the original like young readers of a certain book grew up, but new young readers were interested in that book, they would just keep things in print if they did okay. Well, that's okay. We sell enough that we can keep it in print at this level,
Right.
and we can get enough shelf space at these bookstores all over the country that model works. And not everything has to be a hit. Well, the irony is that as we've had this contraction in bookstores, Borders is long gone, and which because they like the Danger Boy books. I miss the one of the two corporate entities, and then Barnes and Noble was a little less supportive. But even Barnes and Noble is undergoing its contraction as the initial survivor of all that. Some indie bookstores, I mean, and I love indie bookstores, don't get me wrong, but they're having a tough time. Some are coming back, sometimes in specialty niches like mystery bookstore, find like mystery or genre specific bookstores sometimes can carve out a niche, and that's great. But what's ironic is now that there used to only be 3 networks and like 6 or 7 studios, but now film entertainment, because of the model, because of online, can have all these, can be like what the mid list used to be in terms of shelf space. So your Scandinavian noir it doesn't have to win all the Emmys, but if it has enough consistent viewers, then Netflix will give it 3 seasons, and you
Right.
can tell your story.
That makes sense. I guess I think about that kind of vaguely, and I happen to not think of it at the same time as the like clean cut story issue, because my pessimism like turns my face away from the fact that also like there are these new niches that can be discovered all the time and can have something provided for them that's going to be unique to them, but that can still do well
Right.
because of its uniqueness.
Right.
Yeah. I shoot. Mark, I had such a great question and I
Oh,
completely forgot it.
but I mean, Transparent on Amazon. I think the first Amazon Prime series that really struck me is a show about a trans parent. And even though there's later some controversy around Campbell and things like that, and maybe the show didn't end on as strong a note or as promising a note as it began on. Here's a show about kind of, we'll talk about gender identity and trans issues right before they became even more occupied more of a space on the stage of public discourse as they do now. But it was kind of the outset of that. And I love transparent. I mean, I'm a parent. I did not have a transparent, but I just loved its human storytelling, and it was a very wise show about LA life and Jewish life in LA in particular, and being a Jewish person in LA. That was, I mean, the point is, a well-told story, you're going to recognize yourself and your life in it, even if sort of the surface trappings or ideas aren't explicitly you. Any story that has human resonance will have human resonance if you give yourself to it. So yeah, so that's an example of a series that I love, even though it wasn't made for me. It wasn't made for like middle-aged divorced cis dad me, but I loved it.
On that note, I wanted to ask you if you would if you would start with me a franchise of indie bookstore cafes, and every single one, they're all in the same city, but each one is like different genre or different niche, and like they're decorated different. Like you go into the horror one and it's like a haunted house vibe, you go into the sci-fi one and it's like you're drinking coffee in a spaceship.
Right.
What do you think? Oh yeah,
it's a great idea, but you remember you have to. But there's so much cross-genre colonizations. Like, I mean, you think of a film like Alien, right? But so your horror, you're still gonna have some sci-fi elements somewhere in that horror cafe,
right.
And vice versa with the sci-fi cafe, and maybe even the crime cafe. I mean, you could have some. So, but absolutely. But I mean, that's how these, here in California. I don't know where you are actually, Marcus, but be it
I'm in
from
Missouri.
you're in Missouri, so you're in what we call the heartland. My late grandma was raised in Missouri. I never then she met and then she moved to Oklahoma with my dad's parents. And so my dad was born in Oklahoma and he never had a Missouri, but it's part of the family tree.
Right. It's a beautiful place for what it is.
It's good. Well, I imagine, and probably a little more affordable to live there than in some places.
I live in like the northeast part of Missouri, so we're like 2 hours from St. Louis, 3 hours, 3 or 4 hours from Chicago, and so this area is like it's like the economy, the local economy is fine, but it would be difficult to move out of if you needed to immediately for some reason, because you'd need to adjust to immediately a higher cost of living,
right?
Because like we are in the area where the cost of living is like the lowest it is across the country. Pair it with a couple of other like areas that are a bit farther south.
Right. So you could have work and you could be meeting all your expenses and that, but as soon as you make that shift, it's not as if because if you're in an expensive area and everything's calibrated to that, it's much easier to go that direction. I mean, you go to an expensive area, but how much easier to go to a less expensive area, which is why Austin had all those California refugees for a while moving there. But you're right, the opposite direction, much harder to do.
Yeah, no. I always tell my friends who don't live here, I'm on the internet like years ago or something. I'm like, bro, I cannot like move closer to you.
Right.
When we're like old, if you want to hang out and stuff, you're gonna have to move here. And trust me, it'll be fine. You'll be glad you did. It's like the perfect like as far as like just like financially, it's like a lot of people enjoy like retiring here if they're not going just for like something like crazy like Florida beach life or something, because it kind of like slows them down a little bit. It's a more rural, there's less traffic, no like skyscrapers and stuff. I wanted to talk to you too about Two Trickster Tango, the graphic novel that you wrote with the artist Douglas Potter. Is that right? Okay. Because that is like we talked a little bit about how writing YA fiction can be kind of a unique space, and then writing was the graphic novel also for YA, or was it not?
It's funny, I just did a blind submission at a Jewish press that was looking for Jewish themed graphic novels for middle grade and early teen readers, and I don't know, I mean, there's no swearing and there's no overt sex in Two Trickster Tango, but it was the one thing I just didn't worry about the audience, because I knew it was going to be so talk about writing a niche thing. I mean, it was too niche for Jewish publishers, because it's for people listening. Two Trickster Tango, I take the Native American, the North American indigenous trickster coyote, the one who's indigenous to where we're at, and I palled him around with the trickster figure from my cultural heritage as a Jew, which is Elijah. And for people who don't know, Elijah, if you've been to a Passover Seder, they leave the door open for Elijah, who's mentioned in the Bible as a prophet, and he's a fairly avenging kind of priest, and he's raptured up to heaven, I think, and he doesn't leave a body when he passes away. And this allowed in the Jewish, and especially in medieval stories and folk stories. So if he didn't actually die, he sort of comes back transformed, and he's sort of like he becomes a shapeshifter, what we would say now. Even though in those stories it was more like he actually physically put on disguises. But Elijah was always sort of testing people's goodness, because part of his role is to see if people are ready for the Messiah to come. And if people aren't, the irony is, if the Messiah is supposed to make us treat each other better, more humanely, the thing was, we're not worthy of having the Messiah come until we already are treating each other more humanely. Like this great line from Franz Kafka that I like: "The Messiah will come only when he's no longer necessary." So Elijah's stories are about this kind of shapeshifter who's testing the potential, the kindness or the meanness of rich people when they, like, he might be disguised as a beggar on the street, or he might be disguised as a bride. Sometimes he does like gender switches the way Loki does, who's another trickster figure. So I've always loved the trickster figure. You talk about archetypes. I've always loved trickster figures. And so I just had this idea once I started to realize that Elijah, because I hadn't thought of him that way till I was older. I thought, what if I just had Elijah and Coyote having adventures in the West, like where I grew up? And it's not so much about me trying to abscond or sort of colonize a Native American storytelling figure like Coyote, but I figured I'm trying to honor the stories of the place where I grew up, where I was born and grew up. So the ones that were the stories that are already on this land versus the stories that were brought by some of my ancestors, right? And so what if I merge those together? So we have two trickster tango, which is the trickster figure Coyote, the capital C Coyote, who, like in Looney Tunes cartoons, if you wonder where that Coyote came from, that Coyote came from Coyote, from sort of Native American and indigenous storytelling. That's where that idea of that Coyote character comes from in Looney Tunes cartoons. Speaking of archetypes. So I paired up Coyote and Elijah, and I put them in like 1930s California, Depression era, the Depression era Central Valley, where they're getting involved in labor organizing and all this, all this kind of stuff. And there's other mystical figures in there. And it was just such an obscure thing. I wrote it actually for the summer retreat years ago, and it kind of sat on my computer. And Doug is an artist I know who I met in Austin, because I love Austin, and it's one of the places where I routinely get invited back to their annual science fiction convention, Armadillo Con. And I by going there for years and years, I actually acquired these group of author friends. For a long time, I knew more authors in Austin than I did in LA. Although eventually we have more. This is earlier, and eventually as YA authors who around here got to know each other at events, and I eventually wound up knowing as many authors here as I did there. But for many years, early in my published career, I had more writer friends in Austin because I would keep going back to these science fiction conventions. And Doug was an artist who I met through Doug is an Austin friend, although he's in New Mexico now. And so he and I would keep in touch, and he would occasionally do book cover, like ebook covers. I did a horror book, Showdown at Cathay Circle, which is about an invasion of demons, invasion of a skeleton army and ghosts on the night of the premiere of Snow White, which is decidedly for adults. And I keep thinking actually maybe
I kind of love that. What did you say the title was?
Showdown at Cathay Circle. Remind me to get you an ebook, because it could always use another reader review on Amazon. And actually, as just a better beta reader, if you think it's, I'd just be interested in your feedback as a reader. But whether you think it warrants being expanded into full volume territory. So
yeah,
Doug would
no, absolutely.
So remind me, and I will send you. I'll send you an ebook form for that format. Whether we'll see if I have EPUB or Mobi, what I have laying around virtually. But so Doug, so I'd sent Doug. So we're just talking about stuff, and I'd sent him this Two Trickster Tango because I knew he'd like to. I knew Doug liked that historical period. Doug loves kind of mid 20th century. I mean, his forte, if you will, is maybe sort of evoking that era. And I sent it to him just like, here's the kind of story I have, but thinking we talk about something else. And this is some years ago now, and he responds with, "Would you mind if I illustrated it?" Would I mind?
Right.
I mean, and so he spent the next 2 years doing, he'd go through it page by page, and he would email me, I did page 8. What do you think? Fantastic. I'd maybe give him a tiny note. And this would go on for 2 or 3. And then finally he finished it, and we had to do the ebook. And Doug laid it out. And for people thinking, I mean, it's not laid out like the way a comic book based graphic novel would be, where it's based on panels, whether you have 4 or 6 or 8 to a page or a splash page, or you're breaking it, but it's still you're either using or responding to a panel grid if you're thinking of traditional comic book layout. This is more of a, I call it, rather than a graphic novel, it's a novel with graphics, because it's like a picture book, the way a picture book for kids would be, except who's it, like you say, who's it a picture book for? Picture book for grown-ups, picture book for tweens and teens. I don't know, it's a picture book for, I just wound up calling it, the other thing I called it was a picture book for kids of all ages, or I would call it a novel with graphics. And it has a real, people who like it seem to really like it, but it's, you talk about a niche that kind of hard to get broad attention to. And it was too far out. Like I've been in Jewish book, there's kind of like a Jewish network of like Jewish themed books that can go to Jewish book events around the country, and it was too far out for them. And Western, I would send it before we decided to sell. I would send it to Western presses that even would do like Americana stories or Coyote story. You know, they would have this sort of tall tale these kind of publications. Their back catalog was too far out for them. So it's really, you know, it was just a genre mashup that nobody is sure what to do with, except apparently Doug and me. And Doug even talks about revising it and doing a sequel. So I don't know. I mean, for the 12 people that love the book, or the 22 people that love the book, you know, but it was fun to do, and I'm really glad I did it. And it's maybe the most uniquely me thing. I mean, you talk about something. I have baseball in there. There's a sequence on a train. I mean, like everything that's Markish is kind of in this book. Grizzly bears, you know, endangered animal. I mean, I have the whole gamut. You know, California mythology. Pretty much anything I have a bit of in any other book, it's kind of all in there in concentrated form.
Having worked with publishers for as long as you have, like reaching out to different agencies as a fiction writer, or even working with different imprints in other contexts, what are some tips that you could share with people, with like writers, and how to relate to their publishers, and how to like work in that relational context?
Well, you have to do a lot more online research in terms of because agents will be pretty exact about what they're looking for their lists, you know. And if they're not looking for the thing you're writing, don't try to find someone who is looking for the thing you're writing at the time. See if they, you know, you need to have a good query letter, but you have to have a good project. It always helps if you're coming off some other kind of platform. If you're, you know, a well-known TikToker, that's going to get your book look, whether it's fair or not, as far as, you know, the quality of a book. If you're a well-known TikToker, as an example, you will have an easier time probably getting your book looked at than if you're just a person, you know, somebody only writing the book, and you have no other kinds of marketing platform inducements to get them interested. And the publishing side, too, and the reason I mentioned agents and publishers, is much harder to submit anything directly to a publisher now. There are smaller publishers that will look at things, and you have to find them, and it changes. You know, their windows sometimes they'll have a window for maybe just part of the year. Sometimes agencies can be like that too. But I sold Danger Boy submitting it directly to a publisher originally, and then I used the publisher's interest to get my first agent. Because I had a friend that was waiting, a friend who was at that time an indie film producer, and he recommended me to an agent. But the agent said, "Well, just wait till you get an offer. I'm here for you, but there's nothing, and you've written this book and you're shopping at your own. You know, just let me know, and as soon as something happens, let me know, and I'm here." And that's how my first agent relationship. That's much harder to do now, and more likely than not, you need an agent to get the attention of an editor. Usually, there are sometimes exceptions, and sometimes you have to. So have a platform, do your online research, look at things like Pit Mad on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you know, Pit Mad, which is a hashtag for pitch madness, and there are different, and you use that hashtag on Pit Mad days, and agents and editors are specifically on Twitter who are looking for. So it could be like Kid Lit Day, or it could be, you know, Crime Book Day, or Romance Day, or whatever. So, and you find that you can do searches, and there's different websites that will tell you when. In fact, I think one for project I'm working on is coming up in June. So I probably need to start looking up my next Pit Mad experience.
I can't believe I didn't know about this at all.
People, yeah. I mean, people, I mean, so you use that hashtag, and in fact, that's not exactly how my zombie book got published, but it certainly helped. What happened was I used that hashtag, and you have to have a great pitch. And I think at the time, or they'd like you to have. I mean, I'm not going to claim mine was a great pitch, but you had to have a pitch to get someone's attention, and it was and Mad Max. It was closer to when Mad Max Fury Road had come out. And I said something like,
Okay.
Fury Road with zombies for kids, driving across Fury Road in go-karts with zombies and kids driving across LA, or some kind of really kind of like American International one sheet sort of headline,
Right.
And
You give them
and
like a
this,
reference, like an
that's
immediate
right.
reference.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's just like, oh, I want to read. And then so I had a like from an editor, and she was at a big New York house. And she really liked the book, and she had me send it to her. And when I reread it, the book later, I couldn't believe I sent it to her because it seemed much more finished at the time, my opening chapters. And because I told her, I said, well, I just have like part of the book. And she said, well, if I like it, we'll just work on it. And I reread the chapters after I sent them to her, like, oh my God, what was I even thinking sending this out? This was nowhere near ready to be sent out. And I had worked on it already. I'd workshopped it with writer friends. I was convinced this is like in great shape, but I was away from it for long enough where I'd changed enough as a writer.
Yeah.
God, what did
I've done that where
Yeah.
like I go back to like I'll see a contest or something, or like a journalist taking submissions, and I'm like, oh, they're looking for exactly what this thing I wrote a couple years ago
That's
is.
right.
But you have to go back to it
That's
because
right.
otherwise you're gonna send
That's
it and be
right.
like, what? What did I just attach my name to? Even
What
if
was I
it's still objectively good, or even if other
Yeah.
people still like it, it's like
Yeah.
your tastes are going to be different, your expectations for
That's
yourself are
right.
going to be different.
And you change as a writer anyway. But
Right.
what happened was, even though that was ultimately not the public, it would have been great, would have totally revitalized my career if she could have. But she couldn't get it past her marketing committee. The editor she was so like, but as raw as I thought my pages were, she liked them, and she sent me a bunch of notes on how to make them better. I mean, so I got editing notes because she wanted to make them better for her marketing committee. Like, well, it has to be the strongest chunk of book we can take in. And even though she made it a lot better with her notes, the marketing committee still, which also kind of tells you about the state of publishing, is that marketing committees are overruling editors. Editors used to be able to sign their own books. This is not always the case anymore.
That's
But
crazy.
she made it better enough that later, when I had and actually also through Twitter, come to think of it, it was a small publisher that said, we're looking for books in all these genres, including YA and horror. And so I just sent them, I sent them that same chunk, but the now revised chunk, now thanks to PitMad, the now revised chunk of Max Random, and they loved it. That they gave me a contract right away. They were like, here's a contract. We love this book. And we want you to, and I think, did I have more of the book finished by then? Because I think I had actually more of the book finished because of PitMad. So it wasn't just a chunk, but in any case, I reworked a bunch of it. But the initial chunk that eventually got the book published, even though it was a small press, was thanks to some interest that had developed because of PitMad. So it would not have been as strong a book in that second go round had that initial interest not happened.
So, with all this knowledge to share about publishing for up and coming writers or people who are thinking about like pursuing writing as a career or in some capacity or another, like freelance or some other path, and then also having taught like creative writing workshops to kind of transition with the same theme of teaching and working with writers. How, in your experience, did like a writer's workshop differ in ways, good and or bad, from like a creative writing class or some kind of composition course that you'd find at the college level for people who have only kind of been to one or the other and maybe don't know what the other is like?
Well, the writing workshop is going to be certainly contingent on who is teaching it, and there's certain like organizations I didn't know about till after I'd already sold a book, like for children's writing, the SCBWI, right, the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. Pardon me, I'm also now a member of the Horror Writers of America because of my zombie book. Horror writers have a bunch of great teachers and workshops, pardon me, that they offer as well. So sometimes it can be, even if you're not a member of this or that organization, they will still often have public events, depending what kind of thing it is you want to write. And they will have people who are longtime practitioners of that version of the art that you want to do. And mystery writers, I'm not in mystery writers yet, but I assume similar for them, and science fiction writers of America. So some of these professional groups will have workshops, sometimes for members, but sometimes for non-members. So that's one thing to watch out for. SCBWI especially, because you can have associate memberships for a lot of these groups as well, which allows you to come to the events even if you're not a published member. So these are all things worth looking into, depending what genre or or what audience is kind of captivating you as a story maker. But I would say what was lucky for me is probably the first workshops I was really in was after I was published, and I would be in workshops with other published colleagues. Like when we'd have informal workshops together. We'd meet once a month or twice a month in someone's living room, and we'd each bring in books. And that's when I was working on the zombie book. And what's heartbreaking is there's some great books. A couple books out of those workshops got published. One I thought was a fantastic book that another colleague had. Not a thing I would write. It's sort of like a more of a memo. It's like a girl growing up in the South, a period piece. So not a thing I would write at all. But I thought it was absolutely terrific. Her agent, and this is an extraordinarily high-powered agent that she had, by the way, couldn't sell that book for whatever reason. So sometimes publishing really leaves me puzzled. Um, but the workshops I was in, but so the peer feedback, I mean, that in a room of people you can trust. If you're in a room of people whose feedback you can trust, that's incredibly valuable. Just for them to say, this is great, but this, have you thought about this? Or this thing didn't make sense because of that. And, oh yeah, because sometimes you're so enmeshed with your own work, you won't see stuff. So
Right.
So the trust factor, which is not necessarily a thing you're going to get in a school class, but if you can find a group, or even if you don't have to be published yet. I mean, if you have other people that you're collaborating with or working with, you can make your own workshop wherever you're at. Maybe now it has to be a little more virtual than it used to be. But you can have those kinds of collaborations. You can create them yourself, but with trusted colleagues, friends who and because there has to be that kind of respect, because no one's there to savage anybody. And my first, I guess it's not hard. I did have workshops when I was at grad school. I mean, when I was at grad school at SC, it was mostly kind of a seminar/workshop kind of arrangement. So that's probably was my first exposure to it in grad school in the 90s, which of course also dates me. But again, even there, but see, because you're thrown together with people who are just applied to this program, so they're not all people that you would choose to be in a workshop with. And sure enough, what happens over the course of a semester, there's like the 4 or 5 people, many of us who are still friends, even though we don't all live in the same area, we're like Facebook friends, but we stay in touch for years and years. Many of us that became sort of the fastest friends in that particular environment, it's because we trusted each other the most. The reason we stayed friends is like, okay, this guy, I mean, everybody has to go around the table and say a thing like, yeah, but you just like, here's a person who doesn't get it. But I know like these 4 people, they get it. So I'm going to listen when they say stuff,
Mm-hmm.
So what happens? So what I'm talking about is in a more adult professional context. You get to be in the workshop with like the 4 at the end of the table who know what they're talking about, as opposed to maybe the other 7. It's like, yeah, okay. I mean, they're just sort of randomly here, and maybe they didn't even have as much experience writing coming into this grad school program as I already had, or as these people already had, because so you learn how to calibrate. I mean, part of that also is becoming aware enough of what advice to take.
Right.
Not being so defended you take no advice, because everybody, always another set of eyes, which is what good editors do. So don't be overly defended, but it doesn't mean you have to race around and agree to everything everybody says either. It's like that Goldilocks thing. It's right in between.
Right. In the in the journalism space and in the publishing, the fiction, the literary space, how did you go about like building relationships with other authors in your genre, of your style, of like imprints that you were interested in? How did you like what's a good way to kind of meet other writers when you're working in that space, for people who kind of see that as like a hurdle for them, if they kind of live in a community where they just can't seem to find anyone who's interested in the same kinds of things they are to kind of swap brains with every now and then and read each other's work?
I mean, that's a good question. If you're in a physical place where you don't have, having a harder time finding your tribe, right? And wherever you're at physically. I mean, I guess I have to assume that Zoom, and because these tools were not available to me at the outset of my professional writing life. So writing workshops that you can find online, or compatriots you can find via Zoom. However you go about that, whether it's through chat, or some of them might even be sponsored by these groups. We talked about like I've been to a lot of Zoom events with the horror writers, like the LA horror writers chapter has a Zoom gathering, um, which I'm going to be missing because of Oscar coverage this weekend, actually. But so you meet, so you get to know people, even though we haven't met over a year physically. You get to know people through the Zoom screens and what they're doing, and then maybe you email them, and friendships start that way. But the other thing, especially for genre writing, is conventions. Um, Comic-Con used to be a way to meet people when it was small. This talk about something that really dates me. I remember when Comic-Con was small and manageable. And now it's not really, I mean, unless you somehow you have an intro, I don't know how you go about really meeting somebody. Occasionally there are portfolio reviews of places, and not just the big one in San Diego, but other Comic-Cons, WizardCon in Atlanta. But you can meet, but if you're going to do cosplay with people, maybe you meet people that way. Maybe the thing, and maybe the people you do cosplay with um, are a creative community, whether it's for writing or whether you want to do short films or films for YouTube. So maybe that's a community you can have. So conventions, genre. I mean, you meet people there. I'm still friends. I mean, I've been having a film discussion group with some of my Austin writer friends, um, and so we've still been seeing each other over this past year. And they may or may not be resuming their convention this fall. So we'll have to see where the state of things are with variants. And who knows? I might be seeing them this fall. But we keep in touch. My Doug, I mean, that's why Doug is the illustrator for Two Tricks to Tango, because of me going to conventions. And in fact, I met everybody in Austin through a friend I met back in the old days of San Diego. San Diego Comic-Con, I briefly had some stuff published by an imprint, a long since deceased imprint of DC's, that they were trying to do more literary fiction and comic book form. And I sold them a story, and then they immediately shut this thing down, and they're kind of dumping all the stories into the market. But I had this one moment where I was there as a sort of a guest of DC, and the editor of the imprint took us out to dinner, and another person, Lou Shiner, who's a great science fiction, and I don't know what he even writes, kind of science fiction, but it's sort of more kind of political and cultural fantasy. He has a book out from Subterranean called The Gates of Eden. There's a big fat giant journey through the music of the 60s through 2000. But Lewin was writing comics. And so this mutual friend who was in Austin, who was a friend of Lou's, and he used to come out to Comic-Con to get stuff going. And he and I, like Lou had an autograph line because he was at the DC booth. And I'm kind of waiting to talk to either my editor or Lou. And anyway, so we start striking up this conversation on the autograph line. A friend of mine, Rick, and I've had how many, this was what, sometime in the 90s? So I've known Rick like a quarter of a century now or more, based on a conversation we had in line at a booth at Comic-Con, which has led to me knowing all these other Austin writers and led to me being a regular Armadillo Con and, and other writers you collaborate. So you just go to these places where other people who have these interests are, and you can meet them, and you may wind up doing work with them. Film festivals too. I mean, if you just I want to do film, you go to film festivals, and sometimes the film it can be a little more mercenary because so much more contingent on a deal to get a thing to got to sell a pilot, got to get attachments to sell my script, things like that. And it's a little more. Whereas two people, one person, you can just make a comic on your own without too many other people needing to give you permission to do it.
Right. Are you let me ask it this way. What are things that maybe you are most excited about kind of in your space right now in like the young adult lit world or in like film journalism that not the people necessarily don't know about, but the people like that you think more eyes should be on and things that maybe others should be excited about, or that just kind of like are underrated for whatever reason, but that are going on right now or coming up so that people who enjoy rabbit holes can check those out?
Well, if you can afford it, I would say maybe subscribe. You're going to subscribe to a channel like Criterion. I don't want to be like film snob guy because I also have lots of genre stuff. But Criterion is great, for example, as a curator of films you're not going to see on other platforms that either would have languished in obscurity, or they curate kind of genre things well on the streaming channel. My oldest son got Criterion before I did, and the Austinites and I, we kind of use that as most of the basis for our film discussion because we're watching stuff like Japanese noir and things like that we otherwise would not have seen. But that's why they had a great 70s horror collection around the time of around Halloween and things like that. So sometimes just finding lesser known pieces of where not just the same the same things that are in every conversation. I mean, should you see the United States versus Billie Holiday on Hulu? Yes, you should, because it reveals a very shocking part of American political history, which is kind of a separate conversation where we can ask, like, is the movie a masterpiece, or is it just, well done, or is it carried by the sensational performance of Andra Day, who plays Billie Holiday, who may or may not win an Oscar this Sunday, although it'll probably be Frances McDormand for Nomadland. So, so besides the stuff that's in every conversation, try and find out things that are not in the conversation or the history of the genre, because everybody is like, well, what happened in the last 5 years? But what was in your field 10 years ago or 40 years ago? Because again, we're all standing on a series of shoulders. So acquaint yourselves however you do it. Sometimes it's finding someone's Twitter feed. I mean, I don't know. Anna Biller, who is the woman who directed The Love Witch, which is kind of a feminist meditation on 60s, like on American International kind of 60s genre movies, very color saturated and things like that. And I happened to interview Anna when the film came out, so it's now I know. And then she has this very fascinating Twitter feed, right? Well, like I wish I'd known her. I mean, I haven't interviewed her since. And like now, I God, there's so many more things I could have talked to her about, because she's such a fascinating. And she's always referencing. I'm always learning about films from her, for example, on her Twitter feed, right? So that's just one person. But I mean, so sometimes it's not even. Sometimes you have to kind of seek out these people or these sensibilities, and see what they can teach you. So as far as what I'm most excited about, I mean, I don't know if there's any real breakthroughs. I mean, actual like mainstream film journalism is being more, again, like a lot of these brands that used to be in separate separate corporate ownerships, like Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, the two biggest brands in Hollywood reporting. They now have the same corporate owner, Penske, which also owns Deadline and I think Gold Derby and all these other online publications. So there's a lot of coalescing that's going on there. So I don't know. So how do you learn about? I mean, it's true, because again, I don't want to like, hey, you kids, get off my lawn. But at least when I was growing up, because film reviews, they'd be either in newspapers or magazines. That was it. Occasionally, before Siskel and Ebert, they were hardly ever on TV. That was like a newer thing. Sometimes maybe somebody on the radio would talk, but most of you read, and they'd be these essayists, like in the New Yorker, Penelope Joliot, Pauline Kael, but even the people in the local paper, because they were writing, they were kind of thoughtful, and they would refer to other films and things like that. So, so just growing up, being a film kid, reading these essentially essays, they were reviews, but often they were essays. A lot of my film education was just from reading these kind of thoughtful film reviews, and you can still find them, but you just have to know where to look. And sometimes it's genre specific and things like that. Again, you have to do, because we talked about there's so much material out there. You have to do a lot of your own digging, but when you find it, there is some great stuff out there.
I think an important part of that too is the genre meshing that you mentioned as like the reason why we have to be careful about our cafe idea, and also as like something to keep in mind when you're looking for like people who kind of like looking for the secrets of secret pieces in a certain genre, looking for like the nuances of it and the history of it and all of that. I think like you mentioned, there's so much crossover between genres now, and I think that kind of helps, because like Logan, the Wolverine movie Logan comes out, and then a video comes up on your YouTube homepage that says Logan's a Western, and you're like, wait a minute, what? And that piques someone's interest, and next thing they know, they're like, they suddenly they know what a Western is at the fundamental level. They know a little bit about the history and all of that. It has the potential to be like this new like path of knowledge that is just kind of in the brain now. And so I think like, or even like Breaking Bad, when it was coming out, was called a Western by a lot of people. It's got kind of the aesthetic, but even this, like it makes sense, and so it encourages people to kind of look at that like deeper level that we kind of like glance over often in like an academic setting, at like what are the real cores of each of these like genres or categorizations. But you also mentioned the horror genre, and I was wondering, and it's like, answer this however you want to, really. But where do you think horror or any other genres that you think are headed in like a unique or very different way soon? Where do you think horror is headed, kind of in the literary space and or in the film space? Because one thing that has piqued my interest a lot is Japanese horror, but
Yeah.
outside of film and more in like the manga realm, where Japanese horror and manga has reached a point where it's not gore for them. Like what's popular isn't gore and things like that. But visually, it's like this like fever dreamish grotesque things that aren't really like scary in like a Saw or way or something, but are something completely different. And I thought like, well, that's where horror, like visually, it makes sense for it to go because people are numb to gore stuff, like visually, I mean, now, and so where do you think horror is headed, maybe in our culture in film or in the literary space and the graphic novel space, whichever interests you most on that topic?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, also, I don't know if you got my early email. I have to wrap up in about 5 minutes because I have a thing at the top of the hour in film journalist mode. I have to
Okay, that's right.
log into a presentation. And this could be like another. I mean, the way that horror is being used, kind of the way some of the best science fiction was, is kind of sociological examination. Like you could talk about issues in sci-fi, like in the 70s, ecological issues and things like that. Star Trek, of course, was famous for doing that in the original series. You could talk about issues that like a mainstream show couldn't talk about because you were sort of disguising it. And the point is not to disguise it, but the point is you have this sort of freer reign because you're using genre elements. So some of the gatekeepers, the minders of what's permissible to talk about or not, are not maybe looking in that direction. It was like comics, Alan Moore could write V for Vendetta, a sort of cautionary tale about fascism in former Western democracies, long before it was fashionable in other genres. But, I mean, we had that sort of one version of that, like in the 60s, you have 7 Days in May, but then people kind of forgot about it, like, oh, we're okay. And then you have the Thatcherite, Reaganite 80s, and here's more saying, well, maybe we're not as okay as we think. And here's V for Vendetta. So now horror is being used in I mean, Jordan Peele is certainly a pioneer in the sociological elements. And then I'm going to be writing this show on Amazon, Them Covenant, and the first season's about a black family that tries to pioneer, if you will, an all-white suburb in Southern California in the 50s. And both the real kind of horrors that people who did that were subjected to, even if they were emotional. And then, of course, this adds sort of the fantastical horror elements that makes it a genre show. And I kind of like that, the way these discussions that are happening, or a book like Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Indians, and he's a Native American author, and this is a book about Native American, and it's not just a traditional horror tropes. I mean, if you took out the supernatural or the parts that do have some considerable gore in them, it would be, again, I use the term neorealist, it'd be like almost a study, it'd be like a literary fictional study of sort of the dispossession of Native Americans and the difficulties of coping with life both on and off the reds in a land that had been sort of stolen from you by Europeans, and yet you have to make your way through. You have to navigate the society created by these European absconders and settlers, right? So, but it also has these horror elements, and at the same time, he's using horror elements quite smartly to also talk about. So it's not really like a polemic against the white guys. I mean, that is embedded, that lurks there, but he's really just talking about the difficulties in how hard it is kind of to make your way across this this literally broken landscape. And so the brokenness becomes a key motif, I think, in The Only Good Indians, and that would not, had I not written the zombie book and been more aware of what was happening in horror, and now having more conversations with horror writers or my multi-genre friends being more attenuated to when they're mentioning horror books. And I might have not have heard of that, but I kept hearing about it. Well, that sounds really interesting. And I got it. I reserved an ebook. I use the library app voraciously now. And then if I hear about something, I just reserve an ebook copy through the library app. And then when it becomes available, there it is, so, and I'm still buying books, but at the same time, I also have this voluminous queue of things I have on hold, and then they become available. And so it's really expanded my reading as well. But so anyway, horror, I think, horror is almost like where sci-fi was in the 70s through 80s. It's becoming the genre where you're folding in these other conversations. And it's kind of exciting, actually, to see where it's going to head.
Right. That makes sense because we're kind of like breaking out of like the stereotype the stereotypical eras of horror, where it's like at this point in time, people made slasher films with dumb teenagers in them. At this
Right.
point in time, it was like the like gross out horror, and instead we're like now it's the time where horror becomes a lot of things,
Yeah.
you know, and goes in a lot of different directions. I do have one more question for
Absolutely.
you. Would we have time to do it now, or we
Yes.
prefer that I send it to you? Okay, gotcha. Thank you. As kind of a closing question for this conversation, I wanted to ask you if you could go back to the first time, like if you could go back in time, and you could meet like yourself right as you decided for the first time, I want to write something. What would you tell him? What piece of knowledge does he not have that he needs to know?
Well, definitely keep writing. Don't talk yourself out of writing, and be even more fearless in meeting people. I mean, the networking, like my sons. I mean, I didn't have email when I moved to LA, right? They have these other networking tools, and my youngest son, who's just now graduating from college, so but he's one, or my oldest son is also kind of following this writing path. My youngest son is a little more practical. He was a business school major, but he's kind of a fearless networker. And I mean, I was a not bad networker, but in the days of telephones and letter writing, when I moved to LA, pre-email. But partly that is not being afraid to talk to people and meet people, not making a nuisance of yourself. But part of that is, and you have to kind of be able to. I mean, it's unfortunate. You say, well, the art alone. I mean, the art should speak for itself, but you also have to kind of make people aware of what the art is that you're doing. And so I would maybe reassure myself at a younger age of being an even more fearless networker. I mean, I was a fair networker, I think, but I might have gone back and tell myself to maybe juice the afterburners a little more even in that regard. Because in terms of and don't talk and keep writing and have maybe a little more have more things ready to go, because sometimes you can get dejected. And which is maybe partly why I've started a new project. Is if nothing else, quixotic as it is, it's sort of a me inveighing against dejection or self-rejection, and writing anyway, it gets those wheels turning, and then can lead to writing other stuff, and either things that may be more practically sellable, like short stories or things like that. Um, so that's it. So don't talk yourself out of your art. Don't the muse won't always be there whenever you're ready to dance with her, but don't talk yourself out of your art, certainly when everything seems to be ready. And try and be not a pesty. Don't make a pest of yourself, or don't be a pesky networker, but be a somewhat fearless networker, especially because all these tools, even pit mag hashtags, make it that aspect somewhat easier to go after.
I still can't believe that I didn't know about the
Yeah,
hashtag
well, there you
thing.
go. You see, if
I
nothing else, that's their takeaway for.
Yeah, for me it's one of them, because
Yeah.
I in my like online job where I write for the NONAC, I write about like tools online for writers and platforms and things, and differences between promoting on different platforms. And like I didn't know about that, and I want to know, I'm going to ask if I can see about writing an article talking about that, so I have an excuse to explore it more outside of
That'd
just
be
for my
good.
own like personal gain. I think that
Maybe
would be
follow
cool.
some, if you can get a couple writers, if you can like follow their, or you can even look on, I don't know how you message them or whatever on. In fact, we should maybe follow each other on Twitter after this. But if you have a couple writers you could follow, pit mad, good and bad. Some people have great breakthroughs. Others, of course, they just kind of sit there. Their pitches sit there. So that could be kind of an interesting exploration.
If I follow you on Twitter, you have to somehow teach me how to use Twitter like a little bit, because I'm so bad at Twitter. I'm terrible about it. I just like retweet stuff. So
Yeah, I do.
We need a writing workshop where you teach me how to write a tweet.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for doing this, Mark. I really appreciate it. I had a really good time. I think we shared a lot of valuable insight from your, the vast array of experiences that you've had. And so thank you again.
You are welcome. And I got to go do journalism. I'm going to write my my Twitter handle, by the way, which is from my email, but I'm going to write it to you in the chat. And that's both well, that's Twitter, and then Instagram. See, I need to be a better grammar, as it were, a better Instagrammer. That's where I need to. That's where I need to up my game.
We'll swap notes. I do Instagram a little bit better.
And I'm trickster Instagram. So that's what I have to start doing better.
Take a picture.
So we'll trade off tips.
Sounds good. Thank you
All right.
again, and you have a good day. I'll be in touch about
Absolutely.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a good time. Thank you.
Yeah. The door's always open, and plus I gotta send you that horror novella anyway.
Exactly. Hey,
Yeah.
I'm working on a novella.
Oh.
If I could send you like a little bit of information about it, and if it seems like
Yeah.
something you might want to check out sometime, I could send you like the PDF and
Yeah.
at your leisure or whatever. But I would
Absolutely.
love to get some of your thoughts on it.
Absolutely. Part of it. I mean, paying for people did it for me. I mean, absolutely. Send it in, and happy to help kind of pay things forward, and any advice that could be helpful I could offer, I will let you know.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much. All right. You have a meeting, right?
I do. I have to go log
Okay.
in to a presentation shortly. So,
Okay.
all
Have a
right.
good meeting. Take it
Okay.
easy.
Thank you, Marcus. Thanks for this conversation. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.